Hey TCSTV viewers, it's Evelyn and Dave coming to you from the camera store live. Thank you so much for tuning in to our last minute EOS R3 Canon news reveal. Again, from the camera store.
Yeah, we kind of pulled this together last minute. We thought this is a great opportunity. It's a really big announcement from Canon, so let's try and integrate our fans and people online and get kind of a discussion going about this new camera.
Definitely. We're going to highlight a few of the details that we know about, what we just learned, some of our experience from previous models, and then of course we'll have an ongoing live Q&A. And speaking of going live, we have the TCSTV Dream Team behind the scenes. Today we have Drew and Riley with us. And remember, if this is live, and so anything can happen, but if there's any issues, there's a couple different things you can do. You can refresh your screen, or if something does happen, then just stay tuned. We'll keep you updated in the comments. And for the Q&A, you can either put your questions in the chat. I'll also be monitoring my email, which is evelyn@thecamerastore.com. So if you're not logged into YouTube, you can hit me up there. And yeah, again, just refresh your screen if there's any glitches or if your resolution looks low or something like that. That usually does the trick. So yeah, Dave, what are we talking about today?
So it's a little camera, you know, called
little something.
called the R3. So we are super excited about this. I mean, I do like Canon a lot, I have to admit, right? And I've been a big fan of how they've adapted into like the R5 and the R6. So we keep wanting that more, right? We want that bigger and better camera, and the R3 looks pretty loaded. Now, what I'm finding interesting is that Canon usually doesn't sort of tease us with specs. They just, there's lots of rumors, and then the sites get filled up, and then suddenly, oh, the camera comes out.
Yeah.
So for Canon to release this bit by bit and tease us, it's pretty interesting.
It is interesting. It's very irritating too. But I mean, I guess it does kind of keep the excitement going, and of course it just makes us want to know more and more about it. So let's talk about some of the things that we know about the camera right off the bat, in case you haven't been tuned in to a lot of the news that has been released already this morning. So first of all, this camera, Canon is saying, is positioned right between the EOS R5, which we really enjoy, as well as the 1DX Mark III, which is their DSLR. It's also what Canon is still calling their flagship camera.
Yeah, and that's kind of an interesting fix. And I'm not sure, you know, if they are going to come out with an R1, you know, at some point. We know it, right? We have to, right? The writing's on the wall. And it's sort of interesting because the 1DX Mark III is a really good camera, but it's still a DSLR camera, where everything is shifting towards mirrorless cameras. The R5 is fantastic, and I almost prefer the R5 over the 1DX Mark III, given the choice.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's some things that they've taken from the 1DX Mark III in terms of the look and feel of the design from the images that we've seen so far. So the first one is the dual integrated grip. So this grip you can't remove from the camera. So unlike Sony's cameras that are kind of the sport-orientated cameras where you can decide if you want a grip or not, this one is fully integrated. But the benefit of that is that you have the same kind of weather sealing and durability and just overall physical integrity as the 1DX Mark III.
Yeah, now some people argue that with the A1 or with grips that are removable, that you can change the camera size. So for instance, if I'm going backpacking where size and weight is a much more of a caution, you can take that grip off and have a smaller kind of unit to work with. I look at these styles of bodies with the integrated grip as sort of a really working camera. I am purposely going out to photograph a long day, a hard day's worth of work, a long coverage of something or another, and I want it just to be a beast of a camera. I'm okay with the size of it.
You like the big grip cameras, Dave. Let's just admit it there. This is built for someone like Dave. He has big hands. He likes big cameras. Well, just the way it works. But there's some other physical features that we know from the previous announcement and this announcement about some of the physical features. So in terms of media, it looks like this is going to have a CF Express memory card slot as well as an SD memory card slot. Which again is great. It's set up to be that professional camera, the two different forms of media. What do you think about that?
I like that. I almost wish they would have gone for two of the CF Express card slots. I would rather just carry one media type with me, and once you've used the CF Express cards and their speed, it's really impressive. And it's not just what the camera is capable of doing, but your whole workflow, being able to transfer images to your computer is much faster through the CF Express cards.
Yeah, no, there's a couple things that they're setting up where you could almost be a dual camera owner. So you could have the 1DX Mark III and then you could have this mirrorless camera. And the biggest indicator of that to me is that it uses the same type of battery.
Yeah, and that's part of that big grip that I like so much, is that you have a massive battery, and that's what so many people really like. When I'm out working and I'm doing a job, the last thing I want to worry about is worrying about my battery life, and running out of batteries and carrying extra batteries, making sure they're charged. I had a lot of people, I remember with the 1DX Mark III, they'd buy an extra battery just because they're always used to carrying a second battery, and they found they never used that second battery. Where if your other camera systems, right, including the R5, you're going to carry 1 or 2 or 3 bodies around.
Yeah, and the other things are, in terms of the control dials, look at the camera, it is going to have a lot of the same type of joysticks, that smart controller with the infrared touch, which is kind of cool, again, from the 1DX Mark III. We have a dog in our set. Oh, hello.
Ollie has made it.
Don't pull the cables, doggy. we're live. Yeah,
we are a dog-friendly store, by the way.
We are a dog-friendly store. If you have a pup, bring her right in. We don't mind. But yeah, articulating screen. So we don't know the resolution of the EVF or the articulating screen yet, but we do know that it looks kind of that same type of size, maybe some around 3 inches, 3.2 inches. Poor Drew, he's so stressed about this dog, like all around all of our cables. But everything's okay.
So we don't know the viewfinder, although I would think it would be a higher resolution viewfinder than the R5. That's my guess.
Nice. That would be nice. I certainly hope so.
And this is the first time we've seen a 1 Series body with the articulating screen. So they've obviously been able to figure out how to make it weather sealed, because that's another big factor of these cameras, is that they are good in pretty much any kind of weather.
Yeah, well, let's get into some of the guts, because this is where I guess some of the exciting things happen. So the first, which is a spec that we heard about before, was that this is Canon's stacked Cmos sensor. And we know now that it can shoot 30 frames per second of raw images, and that's with both exposure and autofocus tracking. So that's a very impressive spec. The one thing that we don't know is what the mechanical shutter is going to be. We know the 1DX Mark III is 16 frames per second, and so how is this going to position in terms of that speed?
So that's interesting, because it was 16 frames per second with the viewfinder, and it's 20 frames a second. It's 20 frames a second in live view. So you actually gain. So I'd be suspect that if it didn't come up to 20 frames per second with mechanical.
Yeah, and if there's going to be any kind of quality sacrifice with the electronic shooting, if you're going to have to shoot at a lower bit rate, those are some things we don't know yet.
We're excited to find out.
But we're excited to find out.
But 20 frames a second is a lot of fun. It's kind of crazy. But 30 frames a second, I didn't think people were going to be that excited about 30 frames per second from some cameras on the market like the Sony A1. But all the birders yes. are loving it, because the smaller the bird, the more action happens in the second. They're able to capture those more fleeting moments and with more options.
Yeah, and of course we got to talk about the autofocus. So Dave and I are big fans of the new Canon autofocus system in the R5 and the R6. When they first went mirrorless, it took a long time for that firmware capability to kind of catch up to where some of the other manufacturers are, and then arguably Canon has some of the best autofocus performance available now. And it's using the dual pixel autofocus system that's proven to work, again, amazingly well. And there's some interesting improvements here. We have -7 EV for the autofocus capability for low light autofocus. And of course, the one piece of information we don't know yet is which lens that is going to work with. So a lot of different camera manufacturers will use like f2 as the benchmark for their low light autofocus performance. In Canon's case, they were using their fastest lens, and so it either means that this is actually one stop better in performance, or are there some new lenses on the horizon? We don't know that yet. Yeah,
I can't help but think that they are. I mean, they're flushing out their whole RF lineup, and eventually all the popular lenses on the EF mount are going to find an RF equivalent. And we're seeing nothing but great stuff with the RF lenses, right? We can't keep them in stock. They're selling like crazy, and they're phenomenal. They're fantastic lenses.
Another piece of technology that Dave and I were somewhat familiar with a completely different brand with Olympus, was Motorsport Tracking. And so now we're seeing this kind of technology in the Canon system. And I can't help but think that this is going to work quite well. This is using that same idea of deep learning, and so it's programmed into the autofocus system and is going to have the ability to track different types of motorsports.
And it's super cool technology. I mean, with the Olympus, it wasn't just finding the car and tracking it. It was actively hunting for the helmet of a bike rider or somebody in a car. So the more that a camera can analyze what it's looking at and find out what the subject is, it really helps out, makes shooting really tricky subjects far easier.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen it work well with animals and with people, especially. actually. It's quite amazing how much it allows you to just focus on your composition and not worry about hitting that focus, because the camera is doing a lot of that work for you.
Yeah, I'm finding with this latest generation of autofocus cameras, if you're shooting a long, really tough subjects like birds in flight or sports, where there's a lot going on, I'm finding I'm so much more refreshed at the end of a long day of shooting, because I don't have to have that extra level of concentration where I need to hover an autofocus point above the subject. I let the camera do it. As long as I can keep the subject within the frame, it is locking on and holding it. And it's not just locking on and holding it, it's actively looking for the eyes.
Yeah,
in this case, the helmets, hopefully.
And the helmets, yeah. And we had a lot of fun using that type of tracking. Again, back to Olympus, because we don't have this camera yet. We haven't been able to shoot it. But yeah, I mean, it's going to be ready for NASCAR and all kinds of different racing type sports that are, again, like coming back up and coming back into people's lives. So that's really awesome to see. On the video side, of course, with the first announcement, we didn't know anything about video specs. Now we know that it can do oversampled 4K footage with the option of both Canon L-Log as well as internal RAW movie capture. And this is kind of a unique feature because there's not a lot of mirrorless cameras that can do internal RAW. The R5 is one of them, and so it's great to see that they're carrying on that feature through to this R3.
Yeah, and they haven't said if it's going to shoot 8K either, right?
No, and yeah, that's an interesting thing, because it almost makes me wonder if this is going to be more of a lower resolution sensor. And of course, there were some initial problems at launch with 8K recording. It had some limitations in terms of, the cameras overheating. And so, are they making this more suited to performance on the still side and not having those higher end like 8K video features?
I mean, I've always found it interesting how Canon's 1 series bodies aren't the highest resolution cameras. Mm-hmm. So like the 1DX Mark III, right? We're 24 megapixels, right? And you think, or 20 megapixels actually on that, right? And you're thinking, wow, why is it not 150 megapixels?
Well, I think that's the answer to a lot of like sports and journalism photographers is just, the processing power. I mean, in order to be able to handle those files right off the bat while you're shooting, and that brings up another point about the connectivity. We know that it has some professional connectivity, including the LAN port and Wi-Fi, using that networking capability, and so you're able to instantly transfer images. And so for people that are doing sports journalism, things like that, I think having the more manageable file size is a good way to go.
Yeah. Now, we're also wondering, we don't know about GPS, right?
No, we had a question on here, and we are going to get to some questions here shortly. But yeah, so keep them coming. Put your questions, any comments that you have, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so in the past, the GPS units for 1 series bodies have always been an additional attachment that would screw into the side of the camera. Mm-hmm. And we give you that GPS coordinates. We're seeing more cameras nowadays are incorporating Bluetooth or Wi-Fi and connectivity with your phone. And they're grabbing the GPS coordinates off your phone because it's always with you and using it that way instead. So we're interested to see if that's going to have that. It is 5G though, I believe. The Wi-Fi is 5G?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so let's get to some questions. It's 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi network, so you're right on that.
5 gigahertz.
5 gigahertz. So we don't know about GPS, and
who's that Jordan guy?
Yeah, I know, Jordan's in the comments. Hi, Jordan. So someone is asking, how accurate is it for photography of the Northern Lights, please? Well, that's a good question. I mean, knowing that there's low light capabilities of -7 EV for autofocus, it'd be an interesting capability if you could do some autofocus with Northern Lights.
And it would be interesting. I mean, typically with Northern Lights or any kind of night photography, you're kind of going to full manual anyways. You're taking a lot of the control away from the camera because it's a much more controlled environment. Fortunately, the Northern Lights aren't always controlled, and every time I go out and shoot them, they're never there. But but it's typically something we're going to do more manual with. So I don't know about the accuracy of it. I think
we also don't know what the sensor resolution is, but we do know that it's a stacked Cmos sensor.
So I'm assuming we're going to see some very impressive high ISO performance.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Nick Can wants to know, or says, the back screen doesn't look waterproof compared to the 1DX Mark III. But in the press release today, they did say that the weather sealing is going to be up to the same standard as the 1DX Mark III. So it might not look as waterproof, but they're saying that it is.
I have no doubt doubt that this camera will be, I won't want to go swimming with it necessarily, but I put a lot of faith in the Canon engineering, and I've personally put down cameras through some rather harsh elements, and they've survived, and a lot of people I know have done the same thing. They don't worry about it getting splashed, don't worry about shooting out in the rain. I don't like pushing limits a lot, right? But it's, I don't have any concerns about it at all.
Shane Henkelman wants to know, is the 30 frames per second constant, or do you run into any buffering issues?
I'm going to say no buffer.
No buffer. No buffer. Well, I mean, obviously it's going to depend a little bit on your memory card speed.
But we've seen with like the 1DX Mark III, with 20 frames a second with the CF Express cards, you're topping 1,000 shots before it even thought about slowing down. But it's a lower resolution. We don't know exactly what's going on. So I think we're going to have very impressive performance that way, especially using the CF Express cards.
Yes. Comment here again from Nick Can that the SD is a deal breaker as it slows everything down and cuts on clearing the buffer. But again, it depends on which type of SD card that you're using.
So we've seen that in other cameras, that typically a camera will write to the slowest card in the camera, especially if you're doing redundant drives. So I'm curious to see if Canon's going to address that, or are most people just going to run one card or the other? You know, the CF Express card is certainly becoming more and more popular as people are realizing how fast it is, because it's incredibly fast, but it's also on the post-production side of things. Being able to transfer your images off a CF Express card so much faster than you can with an SD card.
Plinky Planky. Sorry, we don't need to laugh at your name.
He wins.
That's pretty awesome. Do you think that animal tracking will be improved on the R3 compared to the R5 on very close small birds moving fast? My R5 is unable to keep up with the subject in terms of tracking.
Interesting.
Well, what we can say is that firmware updates across the board with all mirrorless cameras can do some pretty advanced upgrades. So, I mean, we can't speak to that specifically with smaller birds, with them having closer focus, closer distance, but with pretty much all the camera manufacturers, we've seen leaps and bounds of improvements as time goes on, and they fine-tune that technology. And with the deep learning that's factored into them, they're able to incorporate more species of birds and things like that.
Well, also look at when like face detection came out. That was impressive. Then eye detection came out. And if you look at now how far somebody can be in frame, they can be very small within the frame, and it's still picking up the face and the eye in a lot of cases. So it's getting better and better. So I think we're going to see a nice improvement of everything.
Yeah, another question here about the shutter. So why not global shutter? Do you think Canon is hiding this technology for the R1? Well, the R1 is so far a hypothetical camera, but I think that there's probably going to be a lot of tech that will be reserved for the eventuality of like a flagship mirrorless camera. And again, we don't know what that's going to be, but if we were to wish and hope, a global shutter would be nice. I don't know. What's some of your dream features, Dave, that would be on the R1?
You know, if I have a dream list, using electronic viewfinder has really sort of changed how I shoot. I absolutely love them now that they're higher resolution. The bigger, the better. I mean, if you've had a chance to look through the Sony Alpha A1 viewfinder, right? It's a gorgeous electronic viewfinder, and it's really nice and big.
Yeah, and that is one area that I will agree with Dave, that once well, one specific, where I do like a nice, big, bright electronic viewfinder. And once you look at something that is high resolution, it's really hard to go back to a low resolution, a darker, a smaller electronic viewfinder. And I feel like it's worth mentioning that if you're someone that is like a 1DX shooter, whether it's Mark II, Mark III, and you haven't actually had the opportunity to look through your electronic viewfinder, look at some of the current ones. Go to your local camera store, come to the camera store if you're in Calgary, or eventually make a road trip down and get them in your hand, because being able to see the quality of them, they've come leaps and bounds since they first came out, and your workflow changes so much when you're able to have tracking autofocus. You can see your exposure preview, you can actually see the color that comes through the electronic viewfinder, and it really changes how you do your photography and how you can do your video too. Yeah,
people being able to see a real-time exposure of what your camera's going to see really helps people out. And I'm finding even if you know nothing about photography or you're an experienced pro, an electronic viewfinder speeds up that learning curve, right? And you know right off the bat if you pick it up, it's too light or too dark. I know I need to make an adjustment somehow. Something's not quite right.
Yeah. So. Delta Dave.
Oh, Delta Dave.
A fellow Dave.
Fellow Dave. These are the Daves I know.
He wants to know if Canon will release new glass, or if we think Canon will release new glass along with the R3. 3. We have no idea, but I mean, I think it's pretty safe to think that they're going to keep developing more mirrorless lenses. The RF selection has been fantastic so far, and the only little hint that we have again is the spec of saying that it can focus down to -7 EV, and so is that going to be lens dependent?
I mean,
fingers crossed there'll be some new stuff.
Yeah, they certainly are missing some lenses. They're still holding out on a high-end 35 mil. You know, the 35 1.4 version 2 on the EF side was one of my favorite pieces of glass. I absolutely love that focal length. I know we get into arguments about this, right? But it's 35 mil for me is my favorite focal length, and that EF 35 version 2 is amazing. We don't have an RF version. They do have a 35 f2, which is a very cool little lens. But it's not the L series, it's not their high end. So there's rumors of a 35 1.2 coming out. That'd be great if it was. It seems like all the RF glass has just something a little bit extra to it. So instead of a 1635, now we have a 1535 instead of, you know, we're starting to see some little changes to it.
Definitely. Tube Solo the Hiker, that's another great name. Any word on EVF lag during burst shooting? The R5 and R6 ain't horrible, but it ain't great either, coming from high school sports shooter with dual R6. First of all, how lucky are you that you're a high school sports shooter? Are you in high school, or maybe you shoot high school sports? I don't know. But if you're a high schooler that shoots sports, then that's really impressive that you have that camera. But we don't know with the EVF yet what the resolution is going to be like, how fast the refresh rate is going to be. We've seen good things so far with the R5.
Every generation of camera, sort of across the board, we see significant improvements, especially in electronic viewfinders. Now, you go back a couple of years, and the viewfinders weren't great at all. And now they're fantastic. So if you haven't had a chance to try one out, if you're still shooting DSLR camera, there's nothing wrong with DSLR cameras. But the experience of shooting with electronic viewfinder can really kind of be tainted with the older generation cameras because they were laggy and they weren't great resolution. So you hold your eye up to an R5, or you're going to see this amazing quality.
Well, and again, compared to your R6, I mean, we might see some improvements there, especially if they are kind of optimizing this more of like a sports camera with that 30 frame per second shooting speed. And so, yeah, hopefully we'll find that out here soon and can answer that more specifically.
Yeah, I mean, for them to throw in that, the motorsports, being able to track cars and subjects like that, I have a feeling that the viewfinder is going to be spectacular.
Tuba Solo the Hiker. It's Plinky Planky.
Oh, Plinky Planky.
Was wondering what deep learning actually means, practically speaking. So, I mean, I'm not a technical engineer to give you that kind of response, but what I will tell you is it basically takes into account different profiles, and it actually programs it into the camera. So for all the birds, it actually is going to be able to calculate different types of birds based on how they physically look, where their heads and beaks are, and that kind of thing, and it's able to track the focusing based on algorithms that they build into the camera. And same thing with the motorsports is that it's going to take into account profiles of like motorcycles, different types of vehicles, their measurements and things like that. And then, I mean, hopefully that gives you kind of what you're hoping for. But
yeah, they basically analyze like thousands of images of a certain subject and put it into a big computer, and the computer says, this is what we want to do, and helps you out with the whole autofocus program. We're seeing it get better and better because the processing power in these cameras are becoming much higher, that it can handle this.
Yeah, and for people that are maybe less techie, like some people would maybe refer to it as being artificial intelligence, but if you talk to the real nerds, they say like, no, it's different than artificial intelligence because it's not learning as it goes.
Yes.
It's actually just utilizing profiles that were built into it before.
Yeah.
So. Okay, we're getting close to the end of our time, Dave.
Please.
But we'll see if we can answer a few more questions quickly here. Carlos, do y'all think the iFocus control will be reliable and
we
useful?
Didn't talk about that.
We haven't talked about this yet. I'm glad you asked this question.
So I'm actually very excited about this. I was an owner years ago of the Canon A2E, which was a film camera.
And I have the EOS 3.
All right,
so this is the R3. This is the EOS 3 is what I had.
So it was very cool because you could program it to track your eye, and there was, I think, 11 autofocus points around, and wherever you looked, that's what it would use for its autofocus.
Exactly.
So the idea that whatever you look at is where the autofocus point is going to be set sounds amazing.
Yeah, now with my EOS 3 back in the day, it struggled with my eyes, and I think it's because I have a little bit of like astigmatism, like a weird shaped eye or something. But I'm assuming that as time has gone on, like that technology has got to be better. Like more than, I think it's like 30 years later, but yeah, it's pretty amazing that they're actually recycling this old technology. And so that's something that we're definitely going to test and see how it works. And I might even bring out my old EOS 3
I think
just
they dabbled with that technology way back when, and then they kind of took a break from it, and then they really refined it. So I think it's going to come out, and it's going to be really impressive. We've already seen a bunch of different ways, from like the 8-way controller and little joysticks on the back, to Canon's latest one with, it's got that, what's the smart dial, right? It's kind of a little mouse. It's like a little mouse pad for, right, to move the pad around. And the R5, R6, you can use the touchscreen to move your autofocus points around. Now it's even more intuitive because you just look at the subject that you want to focus, and that's where the autofocus point is, and you push the shutter button, and it's locked on.
Yeah, and again, Carlos, I'm glad you brought that up because it can be very easily confused with eye tracking autofocus, where it's tracking the person you're shooting's eye. So yeah, again, very, very different types of technology, but I'm, again, super excited to see how these are going to work together and how far it's come along in the 20 plus years.
With the more options, it's going to be spend some more quality time with your camera, because you're going to customize the camera how you want to make it work.
Yes. So one more, I guess this is a comment here from Gino Photo. The Canon R5 is amazing. R3 looks to be even better. That's all great. Though another end of the range is lackluster, as RP and R are simply aging badly.
Okay. Well, I don't know about that. I think they're both pretty competent cameras, but I think they're due for a refresh, 100%.
Yes, due for a refresh for sure. I mean, I will say though that they came a long way. Like when the R first came out, getting back to that firmware update cycle, I mean, the firmware updates that they put in the R made it a completely different camera in terms of performance. Like it was honestly kind of a dog with autofocus performance right out of the gate, but it's become quite good.
Yeah, when I first got the EOS R, I'm like, okay, this is pretty decent. I see where Canon's going with this, and but I didn't want to give up my SLR camera yet, right?
Yeah.
But with the R5 and the R6, literally within 2 minutes of us having that pre-production copy of it, I was done with SLR cameras.
There you have it. Dave's wrapping up the show saying that he is done with DSLR cameras. So I think that's all for questions that we have. We want to thank you again for tuning in to TCSTV Live. If you want to be updated on when we have our next video, we have some cool stuff coming up. Actually, Canon is sponsoring one on June 10th with Atiba Jefferson, who's going to talk about using the R5 for skateboard and action photography. You don't want to miss this, so make sure you subscribe, you mash that like button if you liked the show, and we hope to catch you again very soon.